Welcome to the Zero Input Agriculture podcast. Today, I have an astonishing guest that I'm so grateful to get. I think I say that almost every episode. Maybe I should just say it every episode because there's so many amazing people. Today, I have Salvatore Ceccarelli. Ceccarelli. No, oh my God, I've got it wrong. Um,
No, that's correct.
okay, I got it right. So he has been doing amazing work putting highly diverse, ancient staple grains back in the hands of small farmers all through the Middle East and Europe. And when I heard about his achievements, I knew straight away that I had to talk to him. He's like the perfect guest for this podcast. So, Salvatore, can you tell me more about your background and the path that led you into crop diversity and low input agriculture and building this amazing network of farmers?
Well, I started my uh, university studies as in an agricultural university. I got involved, very much interested in genetics and plant breeding. After I got my first degree, I moved to Milano in an institute of genetics, where I studied genetics applied to agriculture for 3 years. Then I started my university career in central Italy. Spent 1 year in US for a sabbatical. And then the real change in my life was at the end of 19, when I was attending a conference of the Italian Society of Plant Breeding, when the then president of the association, in his closing remarks, complained that there were no Italian scientists in the international research centers, what is now known as the CGIR.
Mhm.
I never heard about those centers. And, he closed the microphone saying, if anybody's interested, let me know. And then he came down the podium. And in those 20 seconds, I stand up and I told him that I was interested, not knowing that in those 20 seconds, I was changing my life. And a few months later, and that's particularly interesting, I was in India for my first job interview. Interestingly, because I did not accept the job, but that job was a similar job was offered 30 years later to my wife. And that's why at the end of my career, I mean, at the end of the very many years we spent abroad, we spent in India. I came back from that job interview, and the very same person, the president of that association, told me that there was a job opening in Aleppo, Syria. At that time, I was also working on forage crop. And so in April 1980, I went to Aleppo for the first time in my life. Syria was in a bit of a turmoil at that time because there was a movement of radical Muslim trying to overthrow President Assad. So Aleppo was full of tanks. There were a lot of checking points. But as I never went to Aleppo earlier, I thought that this was the normal life in Aleppo. So I was totally unimpressed. But I remember what really impressed me at that time during a walk along one of the main streets of Aleppo was the diversity of human beings around me, all sorts of people. And the other thing which impressed me is that I felt completely unnoticed. And I said, well, in a place like this, when they see somebody new, why they don't even look at him? And then it occurred to me that in this place there were crusades. Probably Marco Polo went through. I mean, these guys have been seeing people coming and going for thousands of years. So I never felt a foreigner in that
Mm,
in that in that place,
mm.
which is a beautiful, a fantastic feeling. And then they offered me a job, and in September, At that time, I had two small daughters, one of which eventually ended up living in Australia for most of her life. And we moved to Aleppo, so these two little ladies went to the international school, learned English. And this was a special arrangement with our Ministry of Public Education. And I could not extend that stay for more than 2 years, typical Italian bureaucracy. So I came back to Italy, and a few months later, I was sent back to Aleppo as an observer from the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that in that period was increasing its financial contribution to different international centers. And that center, which is called ICARDA, which stands for International Center for Agricultural Research in Dry Areas, was a main target because it was working on typical Mediterranean crops, wheat, barley, lentil, chickpea, few forage crops. And then in April 1981, I went back to Aleppo as a guy bringing money. So I was invited to a major party, and in that party, the director general, who at that time was a Sudanese, asked me how was life back in the Italian university, and I told him that I had some difficulties in readjusting. And then he told me, I said, are you telling me that you will be ready to come back if there is an opportunity? And I say, yes. And in 1984, I went back as a barley breeder. And in 1986, I resigned from my position in Italy. So I interrupted all my relationship, also because that resignation was not taken very well in the Italian Academy. It looks like I was one of the few university professors ever who resigned from this job. It's also, Italy at that time, it was very important to have a permanent job, a job for life.
Mm,
And so I was actually quitting that for a job based on annual contract.
mm.
So it was not taken very well.
That shows
Uh,
a certain boldness of character and an adventurous spirit.
Yes, but I tell you, afterwards, after many years, if I had to go back, probably not only I will take the same decision, but I will make the decision much earlier in my life because I was already in my 40s, and then when I reached my retirement age, I still had so many other things that I wanted to do and I couldn't.
Now, we're almost spoiled for choice here if we want to talk about crops that you've worked with during your career. Are there any examples of crops that you've done breeding work on that really stand out that have proven the potential of various strategies for crop breeding?
Well, this may be interesting to the Australian audience because in my first experience in Syria, when I was working with forage crops, one of the crops which was really amazing was at that time was called Phalaris tuberosa, and
Mm,
then the name was changed into Phalaris aquatica. And there was one prominent Australian scientist who at that time was, if I remember correctly, in the scientific board of ICARDA, who was delighted to see, when he came to Aleppo, to see that somebody was working on that crop,
mm,
and was amazing because as a perennial crop, this plant was able to regrow in autumn, even before the rain.
mhm,
So probably responding to photoperiod. And it's interesting that after so many years, now in these days, a farmer in Italy is importing Phalaris aquatica germplasm from the gene bank of Australia to
mhm.
try it out in Italy. And then the other crop, in which I'm still very much interested, although now I'm working on a range of different crops as a consultant, is barley, which in Australia is mostly grown for as a malting barley for beer production. Although the country is so dry that very often I was told the Australian farmers will plant a malting barley and will harvest a forage barley. because the protein content is too high to make beer.
Yeah.
But in the Middle East is the most important cereal crops in dry areas. And also Europe now the importance is increasing because is in addition of being very drought resistant, which is important in relation to climate change, is also a very healthy crop. Is a crop which needs much less water than wheat and can be grown easily without chemicals. So it's also an ideal crop for organic agriculture.
Is the drought resistant traits, are the drought resistant traits in barley highly context specific? Like, do they depend on particular soil types and management techniques, as well as like a gene that, somebody can sequence and put in a database?
Well, probably we've been working quite a lot on this issue, and the conclusion most probably the most drought tolerant barley that we found in Syria, which were of course the very old land races grown by farmers, they have a sort of what we call an architecture of traits.
Mm,
In other words, there is not a single trait which, in relation to drought, works like a silver bullet. The plants have different paths to obtain drought resistance. For example, in Syria, the barley land races, when they do not have any more water in the soil, they will close the stomata, they will stop the photosynthesis, and they will fill the grain by retranslocating the carbohydrates from leaves and stems into the grain.
mm.
And isn't that interesting that I was discussing with a prominent Australian physiologist who was visiting Aleppo very often? And he was telling me, I said, Salvatore, this phenomenon of stopping doing photosynthesis, because to do photosynthesis, you have to open the stomata.
Mhm.
If you open the stomata, you also lose water.
Yeah.
So this phenomenon is being revisited every about 10 years by physiologists, and every time is revisited, they found that it's more important than it was found 10 years earlier. But if you make a comparison, if you run a trial in these very dry areas, comparing the very old land races with modern varieties or varieties introduced from Europe, that potentially they have a much higher yield potential, but they did not understand where they were growing, and so
Mm.
they kept going on with the photosynthesis until they, of course, ran out of water and they collapsed.
Yeah.
So you see this beautiful plant, very tall, with empty spikes.
Mm.
And by looking at these crops, they had sometimes they had also waxes on their stems and leaves, and that will prevent loss of water. So
Mhm.
it's a complex of that. So our philosophy, rather than trying to look at these local crops, very well adapted to that environment, as material from which to extract genes,
Mm.
we were looking at these as material in which to introduce a few genes that they may lack.
Yeah.
For example, disease resistance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Diseases in these places is not very common because of also the fungi needs some
Yeah.
water and some humidity. And therefore these very old varieties did not have a chance to develop during their evolution disease resistance. So this was probably a problem.
Mm.
So we look at them as a recipient
Yeah.
rather than as donors.
Exactly. Exactly. I love that way of looking at things. I'm really curious too, if you take an old landrace that's developed a trait like drought resistance from one little valley in Syria, how transferable is that quality to other dry areas? That's I think what I'm really interested in. Like, is it so well adapted to that one little valley in Syria that if you put it in a dry area in Australia, it may not necessarily be able to express that full set of traits?
Oh, that's a very interesting question coming from you, because in fact, they did very well in Western Australia.
Uh,
And, in addition to these very old land races, we also work quite a bit on the wild progenitor of barley, which is Hordeum spontaneum. And I remember, I don't know if the place. Do you know a place called Minipa in Western Australia?
uh,
In South Australia,
it rings a
uh,
bell. It rings a bell.
north of Adelaide.
Mm,
It's a rather famous place because every year I think they run a Minipa day.
mm.
And I also got an interview from a local radio when I was there.
Ah,
And it's interesting how well the wild barley was growing up there.
mm,
The only problem for the local farmers were accustomed to grow malting barley was the seed size, which of
mm,
course in the Hordeum spontaneum is much smaller. But in terms of crop, it was twice as tall as the crop that the farmers were growing. Minipa is a very dry place, so I think that the rainfall is pretty much similar to Syria.
mm,
So, but what we try, I mean, to go back to your original question, what we actually tried to export was not the local material from Syria, but to encourage scientists in other countries to look at their own land races. Because there are no reasons why disadvantage of the local barley varieties in Syria should not be found in the local barley varieties in Libya, in Egypt, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Ethiopia, and so on. And in fact, this was true.
mm.
It was so true that at one stage in North Africa and the Middle East, my nickname was Mr. Landraces.
Mm. I'm curious to get your perspective on how much of, let's say, the pre-industrial genetic diversity of those staple grain crops has survived up to this point. Is it surprising how much of it has hung on in little remote corners, or has a fair bit of it been lost?
Well, I mean, something certainly have been lost. Fortunately, a lot of collection were done starting in the 50s because these several people were aware of this potential danger. So that there are huge collections. There are roughly, I think, the last figures I've seen, we're talking about 7 million accessions which are in about 150 different gene banks around the world. Well, Australia is a very important gene bank, which is very open to almost everybody. I mean, this farmer I was mentioning earlier has accessed the gene bank, has requested these accessions. Initially, the gene bank manager asked for a fee to be paid to cover the cost. And then when the farmer said, well, I'm only a simple farmer, so 500 Australian dollars is quite a lot of money for me. Then
Mm,
they send the seed for free.
mm. I
So
was very,
usually, yeah,
I was very lucky to get some swordbean Cannivalia
uh-huh,
accessions from our
yeah.
local data bank, and it's lovely because a lot of those large seeded and particularly important staple crops are almost impossible to import as an individual grower anymore because of the quarantine restrictions. So having that as
Yeah,
an
I know.
alternative,
Yeah,
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 having
I'm
that as an
very,
alternative is
yeah.
wonderful.
And therefore, certainly something has been lost, but there is quite a lot of material which has been conserved. The major criticism in post-industrial plant breeding is that there is very little use being made of of the genetic resources conserved in gene banks.
Yeah, yeah. That's part of the hope of this podcast is to encourage more people out there who might already be growing something to start looking at becoming serious breeders, because distributing that genetic material among many, many different hands and many different places is probably the most secure thing for it in the long run, rather than just being put in a warehouse somewhere.
But in fact, we are encouraging the farmers not only to grow this very old material, because in many cases, you know, one major difference between this old genetic material and the new genetic material is diversity.
Mm,
New genetic material is, if you take a modern variety of almost everything, the individual plants are genetically identical to each other.
mm,
So when you grow them, basically it's like having the example with human beings is all identical twins.
hmm
And therefore, that field is so vulnerable that you need to protect it with chemicals.
mm,
Now, if you grow a very old variety, very seldom old variety are composed of plants genetically. They still maintain some heterogeneity. And this gives them the flexibility of responding to change in the climate, not only in the long term, but also in the short term.
mm.
And in
And
addition,
oh, and
sorry,
that
yeah,
uniformity is mostly driven by the demands of mechanization, right? That you have these large machines that cut at an exact height on an exact day, so all of the grain has to be in exactly the right place so that that works.
this is certainly one reason. The other reason, you can control the seed market much better
Hmm
with uniform seed. And in fact, the run towards uniformity, we believe, has been driven mostly by the requirement of the seed industry
mm
first.
mm
But in fact, don't forget that if you read the paper of Deborah Fitzgerald in US, telling the story of the first year of the maize hybrids, at that moment, we are talking about 1925 or 1930, there was at the University of Illinois in the US, the feeling was that farmers should be able to produce their own corn hybrids.
hmm
But there was a strong opposition by the then very small seed enterprises. And the story goes telling that there was a meeting between the seed companies and the university professors, and eventually the seed companies were able to turn the wheel of history in their own direction by convincing the university professor that the production of corn hybrids was so complex that farmers could not do it.
mm
The hybrid corn, it was the first example of the use of uniformity, even though in that case is a temporal uniformity
mm.
in plant breeding. But then, I mean, if you think at putting a patent on something, how can you put a patent on something which is changing all the time? You
Yeah,
need to have something uniform.
yeah, yeah.
And,
You might be able to give me an insight. So I remember hearing that when NAFTA opened Mexico to imports of very cheap maize from the United States, that it drove a lot of the small traditional farmers who'd been maintaining and producing crops from that genetic diversity basically out of business. They couldn't compete with the lower price industrial alternative flooding the market. Did something similar happen with industrial wheat and barley in Europe and the Middle East?
oh yes, yes. But I mean, consider that the American hybrid corn have changed completely the diet in Italy. The hybrid corn arrived in Italy after the Second World War, which was, as you know, lost by Italy. And then the reconstruction, all the reconstruction of the infrastructure in Italy were part of the Marshall Plan that you probably, well,
Mm,
one component of the Marshall Plan were the hybrid corn.
Mm-hmm.
And up to that moment, corn was an important component of the Italian diet. From that moment, within 10 years, corn became predominantly an animal feed
Mm,
from being a human food. And
mm,
so now several old varieties of corn have either disappeared or they are conserved. We have one gene bank in Italy that is responsible for the conservation of these very old varieties. But well, recently we have been in a place not very far from where we live, where they recovered a very old variety of corn from five kernels
mm.
found in a drawer of a very old piece of furniture in an old building.
Now, I've got some interest in some deeper questions around the origins of domesticated species. And modern research has shown that pretty much every domesticated crop has a hybrid origin, that two or more wild species came together, produced a hybrid swarm, and humans are around at the right time to select out the crops that we know today. And have you seen much work attempting to reproduce anything like that to develop entirely new kinds of particularly staple crops rather than the relatively limited palette and range that we have at the moment?
Oh, well, yes, one typical example on triticale.
Hmm. Hmm.
Triticale that does not exist as a crop and was created by crossing triticum with rye.
Hmm.
There are quite a lot of attempts to cross crops with wild species. They recently in Italy they cross or I don't know exactly how they got it, but it's a fruit tree which is a mixture of the apple and the pear.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it's a very strange taste. Yes, there are attempts, but there is also a school of thoughts that there is still so much variation within the existing species which has never been utilized.
Hmm.
Again, going back to what I was saying before, sitting in the gene banks,
Waiting for someone
and
to notice. Yeah.
the other things that I would do if I if I was still in the Middle East is to go back to the wild species, to the wild progenitor. Because going back to what you were saying before, what happened in the process of domestication was either the natural crossing between different species. The example is wheat, where you have wild species crossing with each other and then doubling the chromosome number, and then the humans going around at that time, probably women, because at that time the men will go out chasing wild animals, and the lady will collect from the ground, not only from the ground, everything that could be eaten. And so she was probably collecting seeds from the ground until she found that plant, many people think was a barley plant, which by a mutation, a spontaneous mutation, was able to keep the seed in the spike.
Mm.
And this was something that came to my mind recently. The real beauty of that moment was not only that that woman uh, realized the importance of a plant which did not shatter the seed,
Mm.
because then with one hand she could grab 20, 25, 30 seeds, which will take much longer to collect one by one from the ground. But the fantastic decision was that she did not eat all of them,
Yeah. Yeah.
but she planted some of them.
That's the unique thing that humans can do. We're this new element in the ecosystem that can recognize unusual life forms and give them an opportunity to prove their potential. Like natural selection always just goes for the nearest best solution and gets stuck, whereas humans have the ability to be supportive and creative and imaginative about the possibilities in a way that has never happened before.
Yeah,
And I almost think it's similar to when insects first started pollinating flowers, and
sure.
that new mechanism for reproduction caused an explosion in a diversity of species that had never been seen before. And I wonder if humans have the potential to be a similar force in the ecosystem, in agroecology, to help create and explore in a way that's never really been done before. And that the last 10,000 years of agriculture have just been a hint about what the possibilities are.
Sure. But I mean, you know, if you think, how many times in the wild species these phenomenon which eventually led to domestication happen.
Mm,
5 plants, 50 plants, but there are thousands of plants. So there could well be an enormous amount of genes in the wild progenitor of our crop that we have never used.
mm, mm.
Because we concentrate on those early domesticates and we start growing them and eating them, and we never went back.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and now with all the pressure of climate change, my working hypothesis will be that these wild crops has been there for thousands of years.
Mm,
And in those thousands of years, there must have been climate disturbances. And in one way or another, they managed to pull through.
mm,
And therefore, they must have, again, probably a complex of characters. Probably will be dangerous to pretend that one plant will have the answer to all our problems. But collecting the seed from several plants, not all the seed, so that they will continue to evolve in their own environment,
mm,
and probably will be a very useful operation to do in relation, probably much more rewarding and much more socially correct
mm.
than trying to manipulate the DNA.
Do you suspect that academia and commercial breeding operations uniquely badly positioned to do this kind of work of like going back to the wild ancestors? Because there's no clear goal, there's no clear timeline, and whatever falls out of it, like you're relying on serendipity. And modern research these days seems to be very risk averse. Like you kind of need to know what you're going to achieve before you even start in order to convince, funding bodies to support you. So,
Well, I
um,
mean, the critical point is just your last word. Who is financing research? Who is financially supporting science?
yeah,
And unfortunately, in a way, both myself and my wife, we've been working together all the time for all our life. We've been very lucky because we've been working in a period of time in which we never had the problem of writing a financial report to money was coming, and we had the total confidence of our donor that we will use it the proper way.
yeah,
This was a typical characteristic of the international centers. Now, consider that the major supporter of the international center at this moment is the Gates Foundation.
mm,
And therefore, there are a number of things. And this was already happening when we were in India. In India, I was already retired. My wife was working as a director of a group of scientists working on sorghum and millet. So this is becoming an additional big interest in relation to climate change, because these crops are even more drought tolerant than barley, but they are adapted to a different type of environment.
mm,
And she's been interacting already at that time with the Gates Foundation, and issues like working in partnership with farmers, as we have done for many years in Syria, was out of question, will never
mm,
be supported by the Gates
yeah,
Foundation.
yeah,
So you see that there are a number of things that you as a researcher can do and cannot do in relation to who is financing and how research is financed. And the problem is that if you look at not only from where the money is coming, but which sort of work has been financed, a lot of financing has been going to wheat, corn, and rice, very little to other crops. And this is another reason why today, for example, you can eat exactly the same thing everywhere, no matter where you go. Probably not kangaroo meat as you do in Adelaide, but you can have spaghetti bolognese or in Tanzania. And this is a consequence of the concentration of research on very few crops.
Do you think that opens up more opportunities for small farmers to work with orphan crops and to bring production and development, research and breeding back together again?
Absolutely.
There's these little pockets of opportunity even today.
Absolutely. You see, one thing that we are telling many farmers is that the waste of time to try to fight against this sort of monopoly of seed and food, but rather a more constructive avenue is to try to build alternative small local markets. So you establish a relationship with a number of customers, and you actually discuss with them what they want to eat, and you grow the crop that will give them food. And we know already that this is happening. We are working very often as on a voluntary basis with a number of cooperatives, for example, in Italy, and one which is about 40 minutes driving from where we live, which contrary to the Australian standards is a long distance for us.
That's me going that's me going to the shops for the morning.
Yeah, but I remember traveling through South Australia and hitting a place where we had a sandwich with 4 tennis courts. And I asked to the person accompanying me, I said, who the hell will come to this place? Because we've been driving for hours and we didn't see anyone. I said, well, people will drive 400 kilometers to play a game of tennis. Well, this cooperative basically grows his own wheat, is using local millers, produce his own bread, and sell the bread locally. And they produce bread twice a week, so people know when to come. This is a bread which lasts for a week, depending on the size. So you don't have to buy it every day as you do usually on the supermarket. And it's basically a closed supply chain. And you can build up an economical sustainable system.
We'll have to talk in more detail about that when we get to the section on building networks, because you've done such amazing stuff there. The last question on the breeding side of things, which I love, it's a fun question I ask everyone. If you could wave a magic wand and create a new crop, what would you wish for?
My passion for it is so strong that I never thought of creating something new. But I will probably, rather than inventing a new crop, I dream of a crop with, for example, a cereal crop with roots long enough to tap the water, even in very dry season for the very deep layer, because I know that down there some water is available. Rather than thinking of a new crop, I've been dreaming of a field where you grow several crops all together. There are 2 words in Hindi. I remember only one, Navdanya, which means 9 species, where 9 different crops are grown as a big mixture all together. There is another example is the milpa in Mexico, where you have a legume, corn, peppers, all grown together. In Ethiopia and Eritrea, the northern part of Ethiopia and Eritrea, they grow a mixture of barley and wheat. this idea of growing crops in a mixture, which makes agriculture more similar to a natural system,
Mm.
is a way to, for example, if you make bread without of a mixture of barley and wheat, the first reaction would be that you never had a bread of such a good quality before. But the problem is that the food system has been organized, as we were discussing before, all around this concept of uniformity,
Mm.
that these ideas, which are very well radicated in the ecology science, are very difficult to be accepted by the breeding system.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even though there are papers written by breeders that consider that we are growing now uniformity, there has been in Europe a strong movement towards growing crops which are not uniform, but still the same crop.
Yeah.
But the future, in my opinion, is to grow field in which you have more than one crop together. And we are just starting now a small project here in Italy where we would like to grow, which is a very old practice, but the idea is to grow more cereal and legumes. For example, wheat and lentil, barley and chickpea, wheat and chickpea in intercropping. So you have a
Mm.
field where down in the bottom you have the lentil or the chickpea, which are very short crop, and then you have the wheat crop. So you have a perfect ground cover, and you can actually breed varieties which are very well adapted to that system.
Yeah, yeah, that's the key. A lot of people, like in permaculture circles, talk about the three sisters and think you
Yeah,
can just throw any corn and any bean and any pumpkin together and they'll do better. And it needs to be the right genetics of each crop that
exactly, exactly,
they have to
exactly.
match the local conditions and match each other.
Yeah. So if I have to start my career as a breeder again, I will start right from the midst from the this idea.
Brilliant. Now, you also work with farmers and breeding designed to help lower inputs. So that's a really big, broad topic. So where do you want to start telling me about what you've seen happen and the successes and challenges over the last few decades?
Well, in my case, it all happens because when I was in Syria and I was in charge of the barley project, we had a main reserve station about 35 kilometers south of Aleppo, in a place receiving roughly, on the average, 350 millimeters of rainfall a year
Mm.
during the cropping season. And then very soon I realized that in this place, barley was one of the several options that farmers will have, and not the main option, because they will prefer to grow wheat, lentil, chickpea, fruit trees, watermelon in the summer, irrigated, of course. And you had to move a little bit, 40, 50 kilometers east, to really understand that in very dry areas, one of the major problems of drought is that it limits the choices of farmer on what to grow.
Mm.
In fact, if I was driving from that station towards, let's say, Iraq, towards the east, then you will see that wheat will disappear, chickpea disappears, fruit trees disappear. The last legume to disappear will be lentil, and the last crop to disappear will be barley. So
Mm.
barley was the last crop grown to the limit of where agriculture could be practiced. And these were the farmers in real trouble. And they will never use any input because it was too risky.
Mm.
The farmers will tell me, I said, do you think that I do not know that if I apply fertilizer it will be better? But you have got to understand that when I put my seed in the ground, I still do not know where I'm going to harvest.
Hmm.
And so why should I also put fertilizer? So I will take the minimum risk, and then if the season is very good, eventually in the spring, I could give a little bit of nitrogen. But most of the time, the crop will manage. And if the crop is very poor, is too poor to be harvested, I will graze it with my sheep.
Mm.
So basically, and then I decided that there was no way that I could serve as a breeder those farmers unless I do experiments in their field together with them.
Mm.
And so basically, I exported my breeding program out of the research station into initially 9 villages in Syria, and then within the years, in about several farmers' field in 7 countries, North Africa, the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, and exporting this idea to training in several other countries.
Mm.
And you can actually demonstrate with formulas that this is also the most efficient way of breeding.
Yeah.
If you accept as a breeding philosophy to have different varieties for different places,
Yeah.
which is exactly the opposite of the philosophy of the Green Revolution.
Yeah. Yeah. It was
And
part of
that's
the
why
Oh, no, so was part of the pressure for farmers who could get away with it to shift to a high input industrialized production system was to maintain connection to the markets and the distributors. Like they had to work like a machine where they churned out exactly the same yield every year, like clockwork. Otherwise, someone else would take their place in the supply chain.
my impression was that it was their natural aversion to risk.
Mm,
It was too risky to use an input.
mm.
In some cases, I mean, the answer could be different depending on which country we are talking about. For example, Ethiopia.
Mm,
I remember my first visit in Ethiopia, where I saw this beautiful experiment in which the modern varieties were doing beautifully and the local variety was miserable.
mm,
And the breeder explained to me that this was because the local variety was not able to respond to chemical fertilizer.
mm,
And so I asked him, I said, can you do me a favor? I'm coming back next year. Just can you run the same experiment without fertilizer? And I remember that the following year, the 2 experiments were just in front of each other. In the middle, there was this small path. And it was very interesting. With no fertilizer, the modern varieties were miserable and the local variety was beautiful.
mm,
And I told him, I said, look, but do you realize that you are in a country like Ethiopia that is not producing fertilizer? They
mm,
have to import fertilizer, and the import depends on the availability of foreign currency.
mm,
If there is no foreign currency, then the only fertilizer available on the market will be available on the black market
mm,
at a very high price. So only very rich farmers, very large farmers can afford to have fertilizer, either because that particular year is imported or because they can access the black market. But
mm,
poor farmers, who are the majority in your country, cannot do that. So they have to rely on most of the time on a crop which can produce well without fertilizer. So, and then my question was, so in conclusion, for whom are you breeding?
Yeah. Sri Lanka is probably a really good example of what can happen to a country when its access to imported fertilizer is very suddenly cut off.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Mm. Now,
And then, but this question is a very critical question in plant breeding, and
mm,
it's called in the private breeding, this concept of client profile
mhm.
is very important. I mean, who is your client?
Oh, I have one really interesting question. If you look at the per acre yields of grains in the last century, they've gone up dramatically
Sure.
with the addition of fertilizers and pesticides. But if you look at the staple legumes, there's maybe a doubling, maybe almost no apparent change in the same time period. Do you have any thoughts about why grains were turned into these hyper responsive fertilizer addicts? And the legumes just didn't seem to go along with the program.
Well, I mean, the answer is partly, I said before, is the amount of research which has
Hmm.
gone into cereals compared with the amount of research which has gone into legumes. For example, that dramatic improvement of yield in the cereal crop started with the Green Revolution, which now is recognized that this is partly due to the fact that the philosophy of Green Revolution was to breed crop for high input agriculture.
Mm.
In fact, the term Green Revolution, which was used for the first time by the then president of the United States Agency for International Development, was the idea of a development package in which one component was a variety, but then you have variety, mechanization, fertilizer, pesticides, irrigation.
Mm.
If one of these elements will be missing, then the variety does not work, will not work anymore.
Mm.
And this was initially wheat, and then maize, and then rice.
Mm.
Have you ever heard of a green revolution on any legumes? So, I mean, but now I mean, incidentally, I'm writing a chapter on which somehow has to do with these topics. Now the philosophy of green revolution has been revisited because, socially speaking, has created a lot of disparities, and is recognized that that breeding philosophy has basically produced very little, if any, benefit to small farmers in marginal areas.
Mm. Mm.
Because again, because you have to try to exploit in those environments where the risk of a crop failure is very high. Let me open a parenthesis. I'm very often I'm referring talking about this issue, uh, referring to a discussion that I had with John, a farmer in South Australia, and
Mhm.
Mohammed, a farmer in the Raqqa province in Syria. Both of them are growing barley. Both of them are growing barley more or less in the same 250, 200 rainfall area. But if I ask John in South Australia, what is your ideal barley variety? John will tell me, said, well, I need a variety which gives me 7 tons in those years in which I get enough rainfall, because then
Mm.
I get a lot of money. And then when I cannot harvest, it doesn't matter, because then I can have some help from the local government and so on. If I ask the same question to Mohammed in the Raqqa province in Syria, he will tell me, said, well, I need a crop which, no matter how much is the rain, will always produce something.
Mm.
Because
Mm.
if I do not harvest, I will not have feed for my sheep,
Yeah.
and I will have to sell my sheep. But if I sell my sheep because it's too dry, then everybody else will sell sheep, and the
Hmm.
price of sheep meat will go down.
Yeah.
So I will be penalized twice: no harvest, and I'm selling the sheep, and the sheep are also socially important. So you see, you have basically the same biological problem that in two different social environment needs a different answer.
Yeah. Different priorities. I actually have an interesting question. So Australia's an odd case compared to the rest of the world that we went from hunter-gatherer food systems to industrial agriculture with almost nothing in between, compared to places like Syria and Italy that have like they've it's a diminished culture of pre-industrial agriculture, but it's still there. It's in the bones. And I wonder if Australia ever had to leave behind industrial agriculture, how would we cope, particularly with our highly variable rainfall year to year? That could you even put a Syrian style, pre-industrial village in those zones in Australia and survive if you have like 5 years in a row where it's too dry to not grow crops?
Yeah. Well, I see, when I was traveling to Australia regularly every year, sometimes twice a year, I very often have people complaining that the current agricultural system dominating Australian agriculture is basically means that you are exporting your
Mm,
water.
yeah.
And I don't know how sustainable is that in the long term.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I was also always an admirer of the way in which the breeding programs were organized in Australia. Consider that once I was sent to Australia by FAO to do actually the reporting on the organization of the Australian breeding programs. And I remember that at that time, I'm talking about many, many years ago, where there was an almost completely independent breeding program in every state,
Mm,
and very, very often in competition to each other. And I remember that with the GRDC, we were discussing what was the rationale because of it. And I know that this now has been completely changed to some extent. But the reason for my admiration was that Australia has been one of the first, if not the first country to actually do most of the breeding work in farmers' fields.
mm, mm,
Exactly how I was doing in Syria.
yeah.
What is the difference? The difference is that the breeder do not talk with the farmer. So
Uh,
they rent the land, but the farmer have no saying on why, I will plant my breeding trials in the farmer's fields, and I will let the farmer go through all the plots and express his opinion.
yeah.
But in Australia,
Mm,
they never do that.
mm,
But this could then you can start building into breeding program also the farmer perception. And if the farmers will, particularly in the more recent years, perceive, have a better perception of the risk, perhaps the
mm.
varieties that he will suggest to the breeder as the varieties that he actually needs will be different from those bred only on the principle of industrial agriculture.
Do you suspect that this is one of the really big advantages of annual agriculture is how rapidly it can change in response to demand? Like there's a lot of talk in permaculture circles that we need more tree crops and perennial crops, but the rate at which genetic change can happen in an annual crop and the rate at which that change, if you find something new that's useful, can scale to solve solutions is I wonder if that's an essential ingredient in having relatively complicated civilizations.
Well, the introduction of trees, of shrubs into agricultural systems is claimed by several circles. I mean,
Mm,
I've been working with a prominent scientist in UK who has been advocating this sort of agroforestry approach
yeah,
for a very long time.
yeah.
Because these will also make much easier to practice agriculture without the use of chemicals. Because let me give you an example, for example, of a rice grower here in Italy. Instead of having these very big paddocks covered with water, with rice, he actually splitted his farm in fields of about 20-25 meters, separated by shrubs. And he was telling me that he doesn't have any more problems with insects because
Mm,
they have a choice and they will go to some other crops.
yeah.
So this is a way, and but in industrial agricultural circles, these shrub, these pieces of land covered by trees and shrubs are defined as unproductive.
Yeah. And
And
you have to fit the machinery in the spaces between them.
exactly, but but you can, for example, decide the distances between
Yeah.
these sort of places where you in such a way that you can still operating with
Yeah.
machinery.
As long as you never
But
change the size of your tractor once you lay those systems down.
the other approach that we are suggesting farmers who still needs to sell their crop to either a domestic or international market which requires uniformity is to play the game that has been shown to be very effective in China of growing several varieties, each one has a place in the market
Mm.
in alternate strips.
Yeah. Yeah.
In China, alternating only two varieties of rice, they cut down the incidence of disease to such an extent that yield was increased by 90%.
Amazing.
And if you plant, for example, let's say four different varieties of wheat in strips which correspond to the wheat of a combine,
Mm.
then if the market requires variety A pure, you harvest all the strips of variety A.
Mm.
So in this way, from a field where you grow diversity, you bring to the market uniformity.
Yeah.
But you
Yeah.
got all the advantages
Yeah.
that you slow down the diffusion of diseases, and by having different varieties with different reaction to drought, you can have a little bit more security in
Mm.
terms of reaction to the change in climate from one year to another.
Yeah. Now, I have to leave some time to talk about your amazing work building networks of farmers,
Yeah.
trialing and growing and producing highly diverse staple crops in Italy and Syria and in many other places. So I don't even know where to start asking about that. It's such an astonishing achievement. So just tell me the story of it
Well, yeah.
and what you've done.
Well, again, it goes back to financing in a way, because we started this work of collaboration with farmers, which is called participatory plant breeding in
Hmm.
Syria.
Mm.
Then this was expanded. I think first we moved to Tunisia, to Morocco, to Jordan, and so on. And suddenly we realized that what we were doing was politically incorrect, because we were transferring the power of taking decisions to farmers.
Yeah.
So the farmers were going to the field, and and suddenly, while initially, let me give you an example. I went to the Netherlands to a conference where I start talking about this idea of working together with farmers. And during the coffee break, one person comes to me and said, "Well, I'm representing the federal government of Germany. Your idea are very attractive, and my government is ready to invest 700." This was before the euro. And
Mm.
so this was the first money that we got. And people were investing in this idea
Mm.
until the point where probably we start reaching too many countries. And that money start decreasing. We had problems in maintaining that big network in several countries. And so I remember one day traveling from Aleppo down to our station together with my wife. We thought, gee, but instead of giving farmers these very well structured breeding trials, what about if we mix everything that we have
Mm.
and we give them a few kilos of this big mixture? They will have much more diversity
Hmm.
than we can probably offer them through in a breeding trial.
And it would massively reduce the logistics of separating and
Exactly.
labeling and monitoring all of
Exactly.
those strains separately.
Exactly. So we made this big mixture by mixing 1,600 crosses of barley in 2008. And then we did the same with durum wheat and bread wheat. Durum wheat was 700 components, and bread wheat was 2,000 components.
Mm.
And we sent this big mixture to 4 or 5 different countries. One country in which the idea really hit the one local scientist was Iran.
Mhm.
In that country, that scientist made his own mixture of wheat. And in one village, women start making bread with that mixture, and the bread was immediately a commercial success.
Mm.
So this is how all started, just by chance.
Yeah. Yep.
So when the two mixtures of bread wheat and durum wheat arrived in Italy, this was 2010. Consider that I did not come to Italy until 2017. So these mixtures went around in Italy for 7 years without my presence,
Mm.
just by informal seed exchange through farmers.
Yeah.
And then I was occasionally coming to Italy as a consultant to different projects. We start discussing about what was happening in Iran. People start making bread. And this was this was the beginning of the, this was the example of Iran triggered the interest of local bakeries to start making bread and see what will be the reaction of Italian customers.
Mm.
And in many places, the reaction was fantastic. So, and we started, we are living in central Italy, but now even in Milano, there are bakeries selling bread coming from these mixtures. This was initially called the Ceccarelli mixture, which I strongly opposed because it was actually made by myself and my wife. And so we now, then we call it the mixture of Aleppo. And then we gave the name of Furat, because in Italy you cannot call a variety with a geographical name.
Mhm.
But we play on the linguistic ignorance of our Ministry of Agriculture. And so we use the name of Furat, which is the Arabic name of the Euphrates River.
Uh, Now, I'm curious if you have any insight into how those spontaneous networks for distributing that diverse seed, like were there pre-existing social connections in the communities where it happened? Was there any encouragement to get people to keep passing it down a chain and spread it out?
In many cases, there was already association existing doing something else.
Hmm.
But they found in growing this mixture, in many cases, there is a strong social interest.
Mm.
And I found myself very often in the field talking about the agronomic advantages of this mixture and being confronted with social scientists telling me, but you are not talking about a mixture of plants, you're talking about a mixture of people. I mean, the
Hmm.
same sort of competition, collaboration which exists in these mixtures of plants is exactly what happens in our society.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for many of these associations that have a very strong social motivation, this aspect of growing mixture. In addition to that, the food which is coming out of these mixtures is actually extremely good. We started with
Mm.
bread wheat and durum wheat, so it's bread and pasta. But now we do the same with beans, with zucchini, with tomato, with chickpea, with rice. In rice, we have to consider. So it's, I mean, this idea is now spreading, and we found occasionally farmers doing their own mixtures without telling us anything, only
Yeah. Yeah.
after
Yeah.
they did it.
The spread of the idea is even more dangerous and unstoppable than the seed, any particular batch of seed itself.
One of the major advantages that farmers see in this operation is how can you possibly patent a mixture that changes not only with time, but also with space. If I grow a mixture today and I give you a couple of kilograms of seed to you, and you are 10 kilometers from me, in a couple of 2 years, your mixture will be different because
Yeah.
it will evolve. And therefore, this creates an incredible amount of diversity. And each farmer will have something which is unique. So it doesn't, why he should go outside to buy some seed? Because biologically, if you think about, there cannot be better seed of the seed produced by a mixture that it is evolving and adapting slowly to your soil, your climate, your way of interpreting agriculture, because there are many different ways of doing organic agriculture and biodynamic agriculture, and therefore becomes unique. At the moment, we are actually writing a book on how to manage these mixtures, because one of the major problems is that although in many of these communities, the idea of producing their own seed is very attractive, technically, many of these farmers do not know anymore how to do it. And we have discovered that this is perhaps one of the biggest damages made by industrial agriculture, that the farmers have been so accustomed to go and buy seed from somewhere every year that they have completely forgotten that for 10,000 bloody years they were producing their own seed.
And harvesting, processing, and storing germination quality seed at scale it's a fine art. If you get something wrong, you can very easily lose so much of your viability and compromise the next year's crop.
And this comes to the social aspects of managing mixtures, so that we try, we are still not there, but slowly we are moving in that direction, that we are trying to create communities of farmers, sharing pretty much a similar environment where the seed production, conservation, storage, harvesting becomes the duty of one farmer in a rotation way, so that, because consider seed production means that you have to invest a piece of land not to produce bread or pasta or whatever, but simply to produce seed. Now, for small-scale farmer, this could be simply too much. I mean, they do not have enough land to do that. But if in a community, a number of farmers will take the responsibility, this year I'll produce seed for everybody else. Next year, somebody else will do it. Biologically, the advantage is that this will help in maintaining the diversity in the mixture and will not be a burden to any one farmer in particular.
Sorry, I had an interesting thought. Has the centralization of grain storage been part of the history of grains much further back than we realized? Like there used to be centralized granaries. Did they have specialists that were really good at preserving that seed for sowing the next year?
In Syria, people still, well, I left Syria in 2011. We are talking about, 13 years ago. Still, farmers will say every 2 or 3 years, we feel that we need to rejuvenate our seed, and they will go to one given farmer that in so many years got the reputation of selling good quality seed. And this was one major issue between me and the Syrian government, because the Syrian government was trying to stop this. They want to be they want to control as much as possible all the seed production and distribution.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they could not accept, although this was what happened at the time, that in the case of barley, only 10% of the area was actually planted with government seed. The
Yeah.
other 90%. So in my discussion with the Minister of Agriculture, I told them, I said, look, the solution is very simple. You take care of the 10%, I will take care of the other 90%.
Another thought that occurs to me too is in the very early stage of domestication of grains, they had special cultural and often religious significance. So the original domestication is believed to be around alcohol production, which was probably used for like social bonding and, ceremonies and all sorts of things. And even in relatively recent times, the workers coming in to harvest the crop would be provided, you know, beer to drink at the end of every day of hard work by the
Yeah.
local lord. And it makes me wonder if reviving these diverse and local and low input forms of staple crops needs to rely on product differentiation, because the cheap industrial equivalent, if all people care about is the price, is going to be the thing that they reach for, or convenience. And you already seem to be doing that in Italy, that you have this appreciation of food culture, that you recognize the value of higher quality food, probably to a much greater degree than people in Australia or definitely the United States. And yeah, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about using that very different form of farming to create a product that serves a different social and cultural role, to give it a competitive advantage when we're still kind of swamped by cheap industrial grain.
Yeah, well, this is one of the, as you can imagine, a major issue also in Europe and also in Italy, because it's very much connected to poverty. When people are saying that yes, we do recognize that the food that these communities are producing is of good quality, that actually the price is not high, is the correct price. In fact, the concept that we try to promote is that is not true that the good food is expensive.
Mm,
What
mm.
is true is that the bad food is too cheap.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean that price, that low price is not realistic.
Yeah.
But and we believe that unfortunately that the problem is a problem of culture,
Mm,
because then even if it's true that there are, for example, in Italy and in part of Europe, there are symptoms of increasing level of poverty. But it's also true that very often you see very big cars parked in front of the discount. Then you see long queues where a new iPhone is put on the market. So, I mean, it looks like that even in families where there are financial problems, the priorities are different from having the food.
yeah.
So the game that we try to play play when we go around, invited to talk to people, things that we do too often for my age, is that look, that the situation of global health is alarming.
Mm,
Now, science has clearly shown that there is a close connection between our brain and our intestinal flora, the
mm,
microbiota. The microbiota is strongly affected by our diet. There is a recent paper now, scientists are studying carefully a tribe and they found that in the microbiota of that tribe, of the people in that tribe, there are more than 700 species of microorganisms. A sample of people in Nepal had a little bit more than 400. A sample of people in California goes down to 250.
mm,
And
mm.
so not only the decrease in the number but the microorganism which disappear in Europe and America are all those controlling inflammatory processes.
Hmm.
And the same article is showing a dramatic increase of cancer in people younger than 50 years of age, very often related to the food that these people had eaten when they were children.
Hmm.
So what we're telling families, I said, we understand that you have limited financial possibilities, but keep in mind that every single dollar that you are saving on food will be reflected in the health of your children
Hmm.
sooner or later.
Hmm.
And this sort of occupation, we have a slide by the title "Food from Being a Pleasure to Becoming a Worried," a worry, because you can actually die of food.
Mm. Mm.
You can die of starvation, but you can also die of eating the wrong food. And how can you get out of the... Now, people, particularly young families with young children, are the most frequent customers of these
Hmm.
communities
Yeah. Yeah.
selling the good food.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
they can see also, the other component that I forgot to mention is that this connection between the microbiota and the brain, as in the most recent literature, is indicating that perhaps we are no, instead of saying, as we were used to say in the past, we are what we eat, we should start probably saying we behave as a consequence of what we eat.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So a lot of problems that now we see, particularly in young people, depression, anxiety, hyperactivity, they are all from medical journals connected to the food that these people are eating.
It's really interesting. I'm fascinated by the story of maize and pellagra in southern Europe as this new crop that was introduced, and the culture wasn't appropriate for processing it so that it could become a staple crop like it was in the Americas. And we had these horrific, long-lasting, like ghastly epidemics, all this suffering. And it was just based on a relatively simple misunderstanding of the relationship between the people and the crops that they were growing and the culture that tied them together. And it almost seems like that's not just something that happened in the deep, dark past. We're going through it again with the industrial changes in our diets in the last generations.
Yeah, I mean, this is all connected, for example, to our promotion of local food. I mean, why you should eat mango in Europe?
Mm.
Why should you eat cherries at Christmas?
Yeah, yeah. Now, well,
We've been in India for 4 years, and we know that the mango that arrives in Europe, in Italy, is not mango.
mm,
It is the only variety which had the skin thick enough to
yeah,
travel
yeah.
from India to Italy.
And again, like the food is being bred and selected for the benefit of the machines that are moving it
Yeah,
around and processing it, not for the people who are actually
or
eating it at the
that
end. Yeah.
this is the example of wheat. I
Mm.
mean, the problem of gluten intolerance, which I don't know how familiar you are with this
Yeah,
problem,
I've
but
got it. I've got
yeah,
it.
yeah. Now, we have been eating cereals for 10,000 bloody years.
Mm.
If you compare, let me give you an example. In the case of bread, the strength of the flour is measured with a parameter indicated with a W.
Hmm.
In the modern variety, in the flour of modern variety, the W has a value of 350, 400. In an old variety will be about 100, 120. In the mixtures I was talking about that we made in Syria is between 60, 70, 90, 120, depending on the soil fertility. So it's much lower. Now, what means a W of 350, 400? Let me tell you how it's measured. You mix a little bit of flour with water. You make a small flat bread of about 5 centimeters diameter. You put it on a machine which put air into this. So it's like a bubble gum, a chewing gum.
Yeah.
And you measure, everything is connected to a computer, and you measure the strength that is needed to blow up the result of this putting air through the. Now, 350, 400, you can get exactly the same value if instead of using flour and water, you make a small dish of chewing gum and you put it on the same machine, you get exactly the same. In other words, why breeders have done this? Because in the modern way of making bread and the modern way of producing pasta, you have machines which mix the dough in both cases, which rotates very fast. So if you have a weak gluten, it will be basically broken to pieces.
Yeah, torn apart.
In the case of pasta, there is another part of the process, which is the drying, which in the industrial process is done at a very high temperatures, 100 degrees, for a very short time, say 6, 7 hours. Traditionally, it was done on the roof for 3 days under the sun.
Yeah.
In the artisanal pasta making factories is usually dried at no more than 70 degrees for a couple of days. Of course, if the gluten is able to tolerate those mechanical treatment and those very high temperatures, is also resisting to digestion.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you start having these things in your stomach first and the intestine later, which is very difficult to digest. Today, tomorrow, day after tomorrow, for a few years, and then your body start considering this as an antigen and start producing antibodies.
Yeah.
So, and this is why people discovers to be intolerant to gluten when they are 50 or 60, and they never been before.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's just such an amazing story, and it's so tied in all the way back to the plant breeding and how it's changed so rapidly in the last century or less.
If you remember, we said before that one key issue in plant breeding is the client profile. For whom are you breeding?
Yeah.
If the whom is the industry, then these are the consequences.
Exactly. Now, I have one other interesting question that I want to ask, getting towards the end of this chat. It's been a wonderful talk. Now, as someone from Italy, you're in the center of a very old and very large empire that rose and fell. And a lot of people today are concerned that the industrial empire that we're now part of is going through a similar cycle. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts coming from your background and your part of the world, how you see that as somebody who can see all the ruins from the last big civilization in your area. How does that change your outlook?
Well, I think that one of the place that had a lot of influence on my way of thinking has been probably much more Syria than Italy. You know, Italy has been received the first germplasm from the Middle East. Somebody think about 7,000 years ago. So we are supposed to have a very rich heritage. And in fact, Italy, particularly South Italy, particularly for some crops, is an extremely rich country in terms of diversity.
Mm.
Take, for example, beans. We now have a project in South Italy in a very small region, one of the smallest regions, and in a very small area, they have 21 climbing varieties of beans.
Mm.
In Sicily, around the big volcano, I think the University of Catania has characterized 80 different varieties of beans.
Mm.
And all, yeah, I mean, it's amazing that in one way or another, all these have reached the present time. But I think that I've been recognizing the value of that heritage because of my experience in Syria.
Mm.
Because in Syria, I've seen the value of these very old varieties, which are probably inherited since thousands of years by the farmers. In fact, in the case of barley, which is the crop which is grown in the driest part of the country, farmers have been producing their own seed for generations. And
That's
it
a lot
was,
of empires that have come and gone in Syria while the farmers have just kept farming.
oh yeah, sure, sure. And isn't that interesting, in fact, that after all what happened in that country last October, exactly a year ago, through Facebook, I still had some contacts in Aleppo. One of the farmers send me a message saying, oh, after many years, probably this year I will be able to, I might be able to plant again. Which variety of barley would you suggest? And I told him, I said, look, I've been away for so many years. So I said, which sort of variety are still available? I asked him. And he came out with a name, and I could not believe it. The name of that variety is actually the name of the daughter of one of my technicians, and is one of our variety, which is still around, produced by the farmer. And on one occasion, 2 or 3 years ago, we went down to Jordan for a conference. And in Jordan, there are many PhD students who did their thesis with us, or either with me or my wife. So one of them came to the hotel to take us out for dinner. And he told me, he said, oh, I have on my mobile still the telephone number of, and he mentioned one of the farmers not far away from Aleppo. So we call him. And can you imagine this guy, even before telling me about his family, how they pull out to the war and so on, the first thing that he wanted to tell me, I'm still planting the seed that we selected together.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is now if somebody does not understand completely the meaning of the word resilience, then I use that example.
Yeah. Yeah. Who do you think I should interview next? Because I've talked to a lot of people in the US and Australia, but I think there's a lot going on in Europe and probably other places you've been interacting with that I don't even know where to start looking for people.
Well, I mean, in Europe, there is a university in Germany, in Kassel. The lady has been working for a long time with a person in UK who has established an association, which will be also a very interesting place to a very interesting group of people to interview.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I've basically three persons in mind. One in France, but usually she is not very responsive. She's been trying to introduce this idea of diversity into the farming system in France. There is this group in UK, which eventually I will send you the detail by email because I have to pull them out from my computer. But they will be probably my first candidate because they are now connected with a group of bakery I think it's one major bakery in Nottingham, and they came to Italy and they actually grabbed a little bit of seed of one of the mixture of red wheat, and they're growing it now in Italy.
Mm.
in UK,
Mm.
and they are promoting agroforestry in UK.
Yeah.
This could be an interesting group of people to talk, and probably the advantage is that they will have a much better English accent than mine.
Yeah, it's been perfect. It's been perfect. I'll follow up on all of those for future guests. And finally, how can people learn more about your work and possibly get in touch?
Oh, well, I have a blog which I eventually can send you the link.
Yes, yeah, I'll add it to the
In
show
that
notes.
in that blog, occasionally I'm publishing articles in English as well. We have a publication about a little bit of the how we went from participatory plant breeding to what is known as evolutionary plant breeding, so working on mixtures and populations, for which I can send you the PDF. And
Excellent.
since we came back to Italy, we've been writing most of our things in English for a very long time. But now that we are in Italy, there is a lot of pressure also to write things in Italian.
Mm.
And but I will send you a few indication on how people can read about our work.
Excellent. And what is your final message for people thinking of getting involved in the kinds of work that you're doing around the world?
Well, a lot of people now think that industrial agriculture doesn't have a future.
Mm.
And therefore, if we are really serious when we're talking about continuing to live on this planet, we have to change the way of practicing agriculture, because this is very intimately connected to our health and to the health of the planet. This way of doing agriculture can actually feed the world. This is another message which, unfortunately, uh, I don't know in Australia, but in Europe, now there is quite a lot of pressure on the agricultural system by politicians saying, with that type of agriculture that you are promoting to save the planet, we cannot feed people.
Mm.
This is not true.
Mm.
I mean, the issue is that we are producing too much food somewhere and too little somewhere else,
Mm. Y-
particularly in Africa and Asia. And the reason goes back again to plant breeding.
Yeah. It's almost like the legend of the Midas touch of King Midas. That
Yeah,
yeah, we wished for something, but we didn't think through the consequences of that overproduction and drop in quality, and all of the unintended consequences that came along with it.
if I may add just one small thing, which gives you should give people a perception on why it's been so difficult to raise more food, for example, in Africa.
Mm.
If there is a famine in Africa because of drought or because of civil war or whatever, do you think, but when you see these bags of seed or food falling from airplanes, do you think that this is the seed and food that these people are usually eating?
Mm.
No,
Mm.
this is the extra production from Canada or US or Europe.
Yeah.
So if there is a crisis in Kenya and they cannot harvest sorghum, do we bring for sorghum? No, we bring maize.
Mm.
And see, there has been no attempts to try to promote research based on local crops in that continent. And that's why that continent is still struggling.
Mm.
Um, uh, so it all goes back to how research has been financed for which sort of food system. Well, let me perhaps conclude. There's been a very interesting paper published by Nature by the title of Democratizing the Food System.
Mm.
I can send you a PDF if you're interested.
Wonderful.
Now,
Wonderful. Yes.
what is interesting is that it's a very short article, which I think is half a page. It starts by saying, look, a handful of people are controlling what is being planted, where is being planted, how is cultivated, how is being processed, where is being sold, and at which price.
Mm.
To get out of that loop, we need innovations.
Yeah.
Guess what is one of the innovations they are suggesting? The seed saver networks.
Mm-hmm.
People saving their own seed and exchanging their own seed. Going back, because if you are not the owner of the seed for many of our food crop is what you put in the soil and what you harvest at the end.
Mm.
Is the beginning at the end. If the seed is produced by somebody else, that somebody else is controlling the entire process.
Yeah. 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 Well, that's a wonderful place, a wonderful thought to round things off. This has been an amazing conversation. So thank you very much, Salvatore, for taking the time to share all the amazing work that you've done. It's utterly breathtaking.
Thank you.
The Zero Input Agriculture podcast is a solo passion project built with my ample time and meagre resources. If you would like to support the show, then sign up for a paid subscription to my Zero Input Agriculture blog at Substack. As a reward, you can read all my past posts and listen to the audiobook of Taming the Apocalypse. If you prefer reading about the past and future of biological technology, you can read the ebook of Taming the Apocalypse through Amazon. And finally, please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you use, since it helps other people find me. Or recommend the show directly to anyone who could use some inspiration to become a plant breeder themselves.